So that's twice today that Randy Benson gave up his place to Russ Baker. So now I want him to have a chance to talk. He is working on he's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and he's working on a film called The Searchers. And he's a graduate of Wake Forest University and the North Carolina School of the Arts, School of Filmmaking, and he's an adjunct professor of film and video at Duke University Center for Documentary Studies. And his films have garnered numerous awards, most notably the Oscar for Best Student Documentary at the Academy Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences Academy Awards. Benson was invited to the Eastman Kodak Emerging Filmmaker Showcase at the Cannes International Film Festival, where he was awarded worldwide the first appearance program for new directors at the International Documentary Film Festival in Anaheim. And his work has been featured on the Bravo Network, on the Independent Film Channel, Split Screen, WTTW Chicago, UNC-TV, North Carolina Visions, Canal Plus in France, Telewizja Loka, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, SA, Poland, and also MTV2 production is wrapping on Benson's most recent documentary, The Searchers, a film that profiles the assassination research community in John F. Kennedy. So Randy Benson, he's going to show us some excerpts, I think.
Yeah, you've seen me around, and so I was just gonna show some footage from The Searchers. I'm currently working on finishing. This has been a really long project. I've started shooting shot the first frame in '02, the summer of '02. Actually, Lance and I went to, oh, by the way, this is Lance Barbour, cinematographer extraordinaire. You see his stuff on Discovery Networks, America's Most Wanted, BET. You see his stuff everywhere. You just don't know it. In the summer of '02, I heard that this guy named John Judge did this thing at American University, and I'd always been interested in the assassination, but just bug got up my butt and said just really want to get going on this project. Heard he was doing this, and I got in the car and drove from Winston-Salem, North Carolina to D.C., approached John right at the spot at American U where Kennedy gave the speech, and said, Mr. Judge, I'm Randy Benson, interested in making a documentary. And he was like, sure, come on. So 8 years later, here we are, 8.5 years later. Yikes. So I'm way behind on finishing this film, but I really am working on trying to get it done. Babies, marriage, and life. This is making this film isn't my main occupation. I teach, work production, do a lot of other things, so unfortunately I can't devote 100% of my time and resources to finishing this project, but editing is well underway and I have a lot of assistants now, and so everything's going well. It will be done in the spring, in time for the festival submissions for the fall. It works in 6 months. So this time next year, this film will hopefully be out. It'll start. I'm going to start taking it to. Start distribution. Sorry, I'm really tired, as all of you are. is start by taking it abroad first, to foreign festivals and markets, and then bring it here. I think part of my movie is very critical of the mainstream media, because if they did their jobs, no one here, we wouldn't be here, right? So it's very critical of the media, so I'm kind of doomed to bad press to begin with. So, plus the Kennedy assassination, alternative press, it's very, and anything critical of the U.S. system is very popular in Europe. And so it's be a good place to start, with the hopes of, by this time next year, bringing it to U.S. festivals, U.S. markets, and that'll be just in time for early 12, which is good. So the footage I'm going to show tonight, some of you have already seen, but I hope you don't get too bored with it. These are snippets of interviews, and so hope you enjoy it, and I'll be around to answer questions after if you have some. Is everyone else tired? Yes. Okay. No.
And hot.
Well, good morning. This is the last day of lectures and presentations, and then we'll have a wrap-up and talk about the future of COPA a little bit, and we're going to try to carpool, for those that are sticking around, to go down to Baylor University, to the Pogue Library, which has a great collection of JFK research materials. Penn Jones and John Armstrong, other people have their materials there. You'll hear more about it this morning from Ben Rogers, but we're hoping to carpool down there and visit the library for a couple hours, come back up. Tomorrow, if you're still in town, we're doing our usual moment of silence on the grassy knoll, 12:30, and we're on what's now the 47th anniversary. And I have one person that's needing a ride to the airport today if somebody's both flying out and driving out to the airport, or has a ride to the airport. So if somebody can give someone a ride, let me know. This morning we have Greg Burnham first, and he wrote to me and asked if he could present, sent me some of his work, and he's working on the National Security Action Memorandums 263 and 273. He was born in San Diego, California in 1957. His father worked for both Truman and Eisenhower while they were sitting presidents. And in 1963, my family attended this is a quote from him, in 1963, my family attended the services for JFK, including walking past his coffin as he lay in state in the Capitol's rotunda. The mood in Washington was extremely somber that weekend, to say the least, and it made a lasting impact on me. I began seriously questioning the official version in high school, and by the time I was in college, I'd become convinced that the Warren Report was nonsense and that the House Select Committee on Assassinations was barely any better. The two most important subjects of his primary research and best sources of information were the late Colonel Fletcher Prouty, U.S. Air Force, and the late Jerry Patrick Hemming. Burnham is a founding member, and that's in quotes, I don't know why, of Rich De La Rosa's JFK Research Assassination Forum, and he appeared in the Guilty Men episode of The Men Who Killed Kennedy program for the History Channel, and he also appeared in the Exhumation of Lee Harvey Oswald, the Norton Report on Discovery Channel, and in Infamous Grave Sites on the Travel Channel regarding the burial of Oswald. Burnham also appeared as an expert on the military documentation in a documentary about the final disposition of JFK's casket, which was aired in 1999, concerning its having been dumped in the ocean in 1966. So this is Greg Burnham.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm really glad to be here. It's nice to know that there's still interest in the subject. My own personal motivation for wanting to keep talking about this mostly has to do with truth-seeking and hopefully some corrections to history. Before I came, some well-known researchers, people that I respect a lot, we were mentioning this earlier, had said to me, well, don't you think that National Security Action Memorandums 263 and 273 have been thoroughly covered already in the past after the movie JFK, among other things? And I said, I don't think that they have. And sure enough, you know, we get here to town, one of the first things that happens is people start asking me about these documents. Are you sure Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam? So I think it is something that maybe we still do need to talk about a little bit more. So anyway, to kind of move on to the chase, we're going to talk about Vietnam policy. We're going to talk about specifically the 1963 era, although this goes back many years. Vietnam started for us in 1945, for those of you who are not aware of that. But let's just go back to the early 60s. I'm going to speak a little bit quickly because there's not a lot of time, and I want to leave some time for some questions. Anybody here okay?
Yeah. Better.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things I want to mention is exactly when JFK decided that our involvement in Vietnam is really an unknown, okay? So I'm not going to try to go back and nail exactly when he came to that conclusion because I don't think that we can get there from here. But what we can establish is some timelines of the fact that he really had come to that conclusion, and we can establish some of the landmarks that indicate that. One early landmark, and depending on how you look at it, but an early one in 1963 happens to come from a very unique source. It's an individual named Marjorie Alice Cooley Judge, who just happens to be John's mother.
He knows her whole name. This
And-
is a researcher.
And John's mother worked for 30 years in the Pentagon, from 1943 to 1973. But by 1963, she'd already been there for 20 years. She retired at GS-13 in 73, one of the highest paid women in the Pentagon. Her job was a manpower analyst. She worked directly for the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. Her job was to project 5 years into the future what was going to be needed for call-ups for draft, right? Attrition numbers for different wars that we were in. So she needed to nail these numbers, and she was expected to be very, very, very close. In the 20 years previous to 1963, she had never, ever been told to change her projections, not even one time in 20 years. But in April of 63, she got an order that came from the president that said change the projections. And those projections were consistent with a complete withdrawal from Vietnam by the end of 64. Not 65, 64. The documents I'm going to show you are going to focus on 65 for the most part. But it's important to note that Kennedy wanted out by the end of 64. This is not the only source. We have numerous sources, including Fletcher Prouty, okay? Prouty makes a distinction that Kennedy said all personnel out by the end of 65. But apparently, in Vietnam at that time, for most of us, people don't realize there were 16,500 approximate Americans there. The majority of those were connected to the Central Intelligence Agency, no matter what uniform they looked like they were wearing. So if in 64 he wanted all troops out, that may be what we're talking about here. The remainder of the personnel are ordered out by the end of 65. Okay? To backtrack a little bit so people know where this all came from, on September 6th, 63, two gentlemen were deployed by Kennedy to go to Southeast Asia to take a tour of Vietnam, to a fact-finding mission, two men. One guy was Major General Victor Krulak, who was known as Brute, U.S. Marine Corps. And the other gentleman was a guy named Joseph Mendenhall, who was a senior Foreign Service officer. They both went to Vietnam for 4 days, fact-finding whirlwind mission. When they came back, Kennedy made after hearing the report, he made a comment, you guys both visited the same country, didn't you? Because that's how opposite their reports were. So Mendenhall was very pessimistic about it. Krulak, on the other hand, was very optimistic. He said the war effort was going well and we should be able to get out. Based on what we know from April of 64 and 63 and other things, if we assume for the sake of this conversation that Kennedy at that stage was definitely committed to getting out of Vietnam, for the sake of conversation, we know that he kind of disregarded Mendenhall's analysis and he kind of went with the Krulak analysis. Kennedy wasn't a dumb guy. Okay, he knew that he was going to have a lot of trouble with the hawks in the Pentagon, with the hawks even in the White House and the State Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency, among others. So one of the things that was necessary is for him to get a recommendation from his military that he could approve in order to get out. That's the way, politically, to make it look better, so he doesn't look like such a dove. Like he's not easy on communists. After all, it came from his top brass. So he can't really go on this report from Mendenhall and Krulak because they're at odds. So what does he do instead? He tasks the two top people, right? Defense Secretary McNamara and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Taylor. And he sends them off to Vietnam for a fact-finding mission. And they spend some time there. Most people don't realize while they were there, does anybody think that they had the time to write the McNamara-Taylor report and bind it in leather while they were in the rice paddies of the Delta? See, it's kind of silly, right? What we do know today is that Kennedy basically dictated the McNamara-Taylor report, at least the highlights, at least all the talking points, to a guy named Krulak that we just talked about, and to Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty and their staffs. They wrote what became the McNamara-Taylor report. As hard as that might seem for us to imagine, that's how Kennedy got some things done behind the scenes. They finished the report. Prouty had it flown by jet to Hawaii, because when people came back from Saigon, typically they would stop in Hawaii, and then they would continue on to Washington. This officer was tasked with handing them the McNamara-Taylor report, all bound in leather, and said to the Secretary of Defense, you and the general are supposed to become familiar with this so that when you get back to Washington, you can tell the president what you wrote in your report. Okay? So that's what they did. They came back, they were met by all kinds of media, and they handed this leather-bound report to Kennedy right there. They sat down. We've got pictures of it. Everyone's probably seen those pictures. But if you look on the coffee table, yeah, it's a leather-bound report right there. Kind of hard to do when you just got back from Vietnam. Okay? So that's how that kind of started. If we move on a little bit here, so we know that that report, pardon me, that report led to an official government document known as National Security Action Memorandum 263. This came up obviously in the movie JFK. You know, there's been a lot of controversy about what it actually meant. Part of the problem with why there's so much controversy is because the manner in which the document was written. Most of the time, a National Security Action Memorandum really is explicit about what's in it. I mean, think about this. It's a National Security Action Memorandum. It trumps every other document. So you want to really be clear about what it says in it. But McGeorge Bundy wrote it like this. Okay, now I obviously highlighted some things, but it's a small thing. Actually, if you can go back one. Okay, this is the actual memorandum, okay? So if a historian or a student of history or anybody went to look at this document, it used to be top secret, but now it isn't. You'll notice the first thing that it says is at a meeting of October 5th, the president considered the recommendations from the McNamara-Taylor report, okay? That really is a non-sentence. The next one is the policy directive. This is the most important one. It says the president approved the military recommendations contained in section 1B, paragraph 1 to 3 of the report, but directed that no formal announcement be made of the implementation of plans to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of '63. And then he approved a cable to go to the State Department. So if you take out this middle thing and don't know what it is, it really doesn't say a darn thing, does it? Who wrote this, by the way? Oh, George Bundy wrote that. Well, his name's going to come up again, I promise you. So anyway, so now if we go to the next slide, you'll see what this actually says. So if a person was able to go and actually dig this up and find out what it said, what's really interesting about it is it says withdrawal, doesn't it? Yeah, to complete the military campaign in the north and central areas by the end of '64, as your mother said, and in the Delta by the end of '65. And here, these are just ways of getting that done, a little bit of logistics. Then here, a program be established to train Vietnamese so that essential functions now performed by the U.S. military personnel can be carried out by the Vietnamese by the end of 1965. Does that sound like we're leaving? Sounds like it to me. And withdraw the bulk of all U.S. personnel by that time. And then again, to withdraw 1,000 by the end of '63 to start the process. Okay, again, this is a National Security Action Memorandum. This is the only portion of that entire McNamara-Taylor report that was basically dictated by Kennedy that he approved. So in the future, when we're talking about future documents here, when you hear reference to the McNamara-Taylor report, we all need to think, no, this is the part that was approved from the McNamara-Taylor report. This is the only part, okay? So getting lost in the details of the McNamara-Taylor report to make these other directives that escalated the Vietnam War, see, that's an illusion. That's an illusion. This is the part that Kennedy established, okay? On November 22nd, 1963, our policy was this one, okay? Moving on to the next slide. Okay, now, to confirm this, there's been arguments made that said, yeah, but 3 weeks after Kennedy signed NSAM 263, there was a change, a major change in Vietnam, right? President Diem was assassinated, and so was his brother. The generals took over there, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's probably what changed our policy. Okay, that's specious at best, okay? 2 weeks roughly after NSAM 263 was signed, there was a Honolulu Conference agenda cable. It was a joint State and Defense Department cable, okay, that was sent basically directing people as to what the agenda of the Honolulu Conference, which was to take place on the 20th of November, 1963, what the agenda was to be. And if you look at the next slide, there's a lot going on here, right? Typical type of a cable. But right here, military is the number 2 item. If we go to the next slide, again, when you hear McNamara-Taylor mission or report, remember, it's not the whole thing. It's the part the president approved. And if you look at here, it says, number 2, military, including report on progress and accomplishment of tasks assigned as a result of the McNamara-Taylor mission. Well, the tasks assigned had to do with what? Well, the logistics of withdrawing from Vietnam. We had 16,500 people there that we had to get out in a relatively short period of time without disrupting the country unnecessarily. And down here, D, outline in terms of force, timing, and number involved the projected program for reduction of U.S. military forces by the end of '65. Okay, so this happened 2 weeks after the Diem brothers were assassinated. So apparently at this juncture, Kennedy wasn't second-guessing himself. He wasn't sending his people out there to say, you know what, maybe I made a goof. And the other part is this, does anybody really think that Kennedy was in the dark? That the Diems were going to be overthrown? I think everybody knows that. Whether they were to be assassinated, that's the question. But there's other ways and places that things happen. So there's no question that the people in the State Department and in the White House, including McGeorge Bundy, everyone was aware that there was a high probability that the Diems would be replaced no matter how that happened. So it was part of his plan going in when he signed NSAM 263, in my opinion anyway, with or without the Diems, that this is what our policy was going to be. And I think this kind of tends to support that. Okay? You go to the next slide. That's just the rest of that cable. None of it has to do with military. This is like the plans on who's going to get on what plane and things like that. So again, as of, interesting, today's the anniversary, right? It's the 21st. I don't mean of the assassination. It's the 21st of an important document, though. So 47 years ago today, we know on the 21st of November, 263 was in full force. We know that it was total withdrawal. We also know that there was a document called NSAM 273. There's a draft of it, and that's the one I'm going to focus on. Okay, I want to thank people like Peter Dale Scott, James Galbraith. I mean, they've done some outstanding work on NSAM 273, the final version. Okay, and I recommend them highly. But what I want to focus on myself is the draft of the document, because the draft happened the day before the assassination, November 21st, '63. And if you recall, it was the central object at that time of the U.S. government to withdraw from Vietnam. Okay? If you go to the next slide. And this is just the first page of the draft of the document in text, so you can kind of see it. And if you can go back again, real quick. Okay, and I just want to point one thing out, and we'll get to this again more, but right there it says, the test of all decisions and U.S. actions in this area should be the effectiveness of their contribution to this purpose. You can move on to the next one. See, because if you didn't read the rest of that, you kind of think, right, you need to withdraw. Right? On the 21st of November, Kennedy was alive. That was his last orders. But the first sentence of the document, very first, says this. The President has reviewed the discussions in South Vietnam which occurred in Honolulu and has discussed the matter further with Ambassador Lodge. Well, gee, this is the 21st of November, folks. He was in Texas. I mean, he flew on Air Force One with Jackie on the 20th. They had their conference on the 20th and part of the 21st. And McGeorge Bundy wrote this document the evening of the 21st. Kennedy was on a tight trip here. You guys all know that. We're all researchers, right? Very tight schedule. He spoke in a meaningful way about the Honolulu conference, I guess over the phone, and said, I'm changing my mind. I'm not buying that for a second. Okay, but that's what we're to believe. So you move on here. We can confirm something else from the Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers. The meeting, this is referring to the Honolulu conference, ended inconclusively after Ambassador Lodge had conferred with the President a few days later in Washington. And the White House tried to pull together some conclusions and offer some guidance for our continuing and now deeper involvement in Vietnam. This all happened in one day? Well, that's just kind of an amazing thing to me. But we know that the first and only president that conferred with anybody about the Honolulu Conference was LBJ. It's absolutely not in question at this point. So I have, just an interesting maybe aside. We have two different presidents. They're both at odds with each other. The Vice President of the United States, Johnson, and Kennedy, come on. They didn't see eye to eye on most things, right? They butted heads all the time. Yet McGeorge Bundy writes a document that he just nails for the guy coming in. Isn't that kind of interesting? Barely a change to it. We'll talk about the changes he made a little bit. Peter Del Scott again's done a great job with that, so has Kenneth Galbraith, but just an amazing, he's psychic. Okay, so if we move on to the next one. The first sentence, getting back to this one, it remains the central object of the United States and South Vietnam to assist the people and government of that country to win their contest against the externally directed and supported communist conspiracy. Does that sound like withdrawal to you? See, on November 21st, Kennedy's policy was not to win the contest against them. That was over. We were moving out. We were going to switch things over. So somebody knew something, it seems to me, on the 21st. The test of all decisions and U.S. actions in this area should be the effectiveness of their contribution to this purpose. So now McGeorge Bundy has made the winning of the contest against the conspiracy, the communist conspiracy in Vietnam, the way that you measure literally everything else that's done in government regarding this issue. And that just seems to me like a major policy change before the fact. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. The New York Times came out on the 21st. Actually, it was dated the 20th, but I think it hit the stands the 21st. The New York Times, this came from microfiche from Fletcher Prouty. And if you go to the next slide, since we can't read that too well, and I just kind of highlighted a few points. So again, this is the day right after the conference, or actually the 20th, so the day of the conference, right after it. And I'll just skip ahead to the department spokesman reported tonight an encouraging outlook. They said the United States had already established excellent working relations with the new Vietnamese government. So that kind of throws out the idea that everybody was so scared because the DMs were gone. Now we have an excellent relationship with them, according to this. And these were the assessments emerging tonight from the administration's first full-scale review of the Vietnam situation since the military coup in which DM was killed. And down here, there were no basic changes in United States policies and commitments to South Vietnam. And down here, the spokesman declined, however, to disclose any recommended changes until Secretary McNamara and Ambassador Lodge have an opportunity to report to President Kennedy later this week. Okay? So, yeah, sure, there are going to be some changes. Sure, to implement policies, yeah, you make changes. Do you reverse policy without talking to the President first? Well, you wouldn't think so. The next slide goes to the Foreign Relations of the United States. This is a State Department document. So I said to myself, you know what, maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe there's stuff in the record that shows that they actually discussed Vietnam. And they actually discussed withdrawing from Vietnam and said, no, that's not going to work. And they had all these great reasons why, and they were going to come back and they were going to tell it to Kennedy. And McGeorge Bundy wrote 273 with such confidence that he knew Kennedy was going to sign something that we all know Kennedy never would have signed, but the force of those conferences changed his mind too. Okay, what if that was the case? So you try to find the notes from the Honolulu conference, kind of hard to do. If you get to the Foreign Relations of the United States version, right, which is, there's only 3 paragraphs, by the way. There's 16 pages memorialized there. 16 pages in the Foreign Relations of the United States. But there's only 3 small paragraphs. They look big here because I blew them up. There's 3 small paragraphs that mention anything about the Taylor-McNamara report. If you recall, when we hear that, it means withdrawal. And anything about withdrawal in it, 3 small paragraphs. And when you read them, well, they seem to be consistent with withdrawal to me. First, as regards to all U.S. programs, military, economic, psychological, we should keep before us the goal of setting dates for phasing out U.S. activities and turning them over to the Vietnamese. The next, the date mentioned in the McNamara-Taylor statement of October 2 on U.S. military withdrawal had and is still having a tonic effect. So the Vietnamese seem to be kind of enthusiastic about taking over the effort themselves. Accomplishment of tasks assigned as a result of the McNamara report. I should have bolded all that. Prospects and measures proposed by country team for improved prosecution of the war under the new government, including progress in accomplishments of tasks assigned as a result of the McNamara-Taylor mission. And finally, it says, here follows discussions, blah, 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 reduction of U.S. military forces by the end of fiscal year 65. Next slide. Here follows discussions. What discussions? You see, because that's where it ends. You all can all go look there yourself, okay? It's the Foreign Relations of the United States, right? Our involvement in Vietnam. It's volume 4, August 63 through December 31st, 63, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. The next entry in the FRUS is November 22nd, 63 at 8 o'clock in the morning, where McGeorge Bundy is sitting there providing over a breakfast or a daily staff meeting. And he's commenting about how nice it was to go to Honolulu and how great it was to have, these accommodations and blah, 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 blah. So we don't know what discussions followed that could have possibly led to NSAM 273 and us being now totally committed to winning the contest against the conspiracy as opposed to the withdrawal, because we know on the 21st the policy of the President of the United States in this country was withdrawal. It had nothing to do with what McGeorge Bundy wrote in that document. We move on to the next one. And this is the last one I'll go through. This particular paragraph disappeared from the final version of National Security Action Memorandum 273. The only person I've ever heard talk about it was Fletcher Prouty. And the significance of it, I think everybody kind of has to make their own mind up if it has significance or if it doesn't, But just, what is he talking about here? I mean, the word Vietnam in every other paragraph of NSAM 273, even the draft, has the word Vietnam in it, or the McNamara-Taylor report, because that's what they were talking about. See, and I just don't understand what he's talking about. Prouty didn't either, and he says it was a really important part of it. In fact, Prouty said this was, the draft was circulated throughout the government on the planes on their way back from the Honolulu conference, and also the cabinet on their way to Tokyo, on their way to Japan for their economic summit. We have notes with, from McGeorge Bundy to his brother Bill Bundy, and making sure he talks to Secretary McNamara and all these other folks. So it's almost like there's everybody prepare for something, because it's the highest importance that the United States government avoid either the appearance or the reality of public recrimination from one part of it against another. For what? For what? We had secret meetings in Hawaii that nobody knows about, and I better write this down? What? And the President expects that all senior officers of the government will take energetic steps to ensure that they and their subordinates go out of their way to maintain and to defend the unity of the United States government both here and in the field. Gee, it sounds like we're going to have a coup d'etat. Sounds like to me. Now, that's just my interpretation. Maybe it didn't mean that at all. But I can't, they say, Occam's razor, right? Simple explanation, preferable to the more complex, as long as it's adequate to the evidence. My dad used to say, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. I'm not sure if this is a duck or not, but that's my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, and if everybody had any questions as well. Yes, sir.
Greg, do you think George Bundy was involved in the coup d'etat? And ditto question for Henry Lodge.
Say that last part?
Same question for Henry Cabot Lodge.
Oh, those are tough questions for me to answer, to be honest with you.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, his question basically was, do I personally think that McGeorge Bundy and or Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge were involved in the quote-unquote coup d'etat? Okay? And part of my answer to that would be a flat-out no, in one sense, in terms of, well, obviously you're not talking about shooters. But how far up the chain here did they go? I don't know. What I will comment on, I feel strongly that they had foreknowledge. Okay? Particularly McGeorge Bundy had foreknowledge. I am also convinced that Henry Cabot Lodge had a lot to do with an attempt to unsettle Vietnam. As we know, he was quite responsible for the demise of the DMs. I mean, he contributed to that heavily. And for what possible motivation do you do something like that, to destabilize the government? So.
Wasn't McBundy in charge of the Rockefeller Foundation?
Yes, prior to.
And Kissinger, of course, had a relationship.
Well, there are a lot of different relationships.
So my question there would have been, is
I believe
this
Rusk
really
is
the Rockefellerization of
This-
American foreign policy?
Yeah, to be honest with you, that's an area that I'm not going to explore because I'm trying to focus here. And I'm not saying it's not a good question, because it is. It's just one that I don't have an adequate answer for in the short time.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Oh, yes, sir.
Well, Arthur Kroc wrote that article, Kennedy would come from the CIA to the Pentagon or ever an overthrow, and I know that he thought, like giving that job to Henry Cabot Lodge, he was kind of putting a thorn in his side, but then it started working against him. But George Bundy, I remember reading, someone from the plane calls down to the ground and is talking about a lone nut known at 35,000 feet.
That was another question, but that's it, I guess.
Yeah, there are so many anomalies, as you all know, in this. You know, the investigations were done so poorly that I think there's a lot of questions that we'll all have for a long time. Yeah,
Any idea when loyalty turned away from JFK? I mean, if he hired him onto his staff, you're loyal to the guy who hires you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. My first inkling of when I'm not sure whether he ever was, okay? And again, that's just my personal opinion. I don't know that he ever was. I know that as soon as as quickly as the Bay of Pigs, right, we know that he's the person who called General Cabell, right, in the